Day one of building a custom Shovelhead. Your buddy Brad's going to send you his bike wrapped up nice and tight on a pallet all the way across the country. You're going to want to go ahead and get that thing unwrapped and just kind of get it mocked up and start staring at it. To me, the staring process is probably the most important. I probably stared at this thing for 2 months before I actually started working on it. Other than, I knew I wanted to put this Buell front end on from my Buell build that I had done. That's the bike that I got hit on. So this front end is actually not super straight, but hoping it doesn't really throw off how the frame sits or anything. Fingers crossed at this point. Gonna start cutting everything off that I know I'm not using. These Paco frames kind of come set up to run any and all bolt-ons. It's kind of a compromise style of building frames. They don't really build them to any one specific year. Probably early 70s is the closest you'll see on these. Don't quote me on that shit. I know the hardcore chopper guys are going to be like, well, actually. But yeah, cut all that shit off that you're not going to use. The fender and the tank were already painted back when this was supposed to be just a freshening project. Basically, the backstory on this thing is Brad bought this bike. It was built out of Texas at some point, and it was just a narrow bobber, classic shovelhead type stuff. Nothing too elaborate. The frame did have a hardtail put on it, suicide shift. And then later, after he got the tanks painted, he found out the frame was actually broken. And it was broken in a way and in an area that cost effective, it wasn't worth fixing. So now moving on to the seat first. I had already put the tank up in the mounts that Paco had put on, so I felt there was no reason in moving the tank forward or backwards. So now I knew where the back of the tank was. I could figure out how far back I could put the seat. I think the seat on a lot of custom bikes is really a make or break where that position is. When you're riding on the bike, you don't notice it because your body kind of covers it, but when you get off the bike, they can look pretty damn goofy, especially these spring solo seats. Brad had already bought it. He really wanted to use it. I'm not typically a fan of how these look. They sit really high on the springs, and I'm just not a fan of the tractor look for most things, but they are pretty comfortable on a rigid like this. So I've got some material tacked on here that I believe was actually off of this bike, something that I had cut off of a mount for something else, but I know I'm reusing this material. It's already threaded. All I had to do was take it to a lathe, polish off the tops. I really wish I kind of fish mouth these a little better because I had a lot of gap to fill and try not to make look like total shit here. Not a huge fan of MIG welders. I've never been a good aesthetic MIG welder. So they tend to just, it just looks kind of shitty compared to a good TIG weld. But got that on, happy with where it is. Absolutely hate how it looks at this point. One thing I will tell you is you got to trust the process and trust your gut to an extent. Moving on to the oil tank. This was going to be kind of a challenge because there were no mounts for an oil tank, at least not this style. Stock style horseshoe tanks, those mounts were there, but for a little tank like this, yeah, no. Yeah, I discovered that my bandsaw, I did this whole modification to it to make it a metalworking bandsaw, and it didn't fucking work, so hand bandsaw it is. A lot of this stuff is kind of eyeballed to figure out where it goes, and then there's a lot of squaring to find center, and then you measure those mount holes. I typically work off of nominal measurements. I don't actually go by what I measured. I go to the nearest logical nominal number. It tends to work out better. That's what they tried to manufacture these parts to, so that's what I'm aiming for rather than trying to go to a measured amount. The big thing on this oil tank is it's got these machined ribs in the side of it, and I want them to sit level to the bottom of the frame. And that means I've got to make mounts that sit within the frame and sit level to the bottom of the frame. I don't have a jig table or anything like that, so I'm trying to figure out a way to, get this tank centered, then draw the inner frame rail lines, cut that out so I can actually get this thing up inside the frame rather than just welding this big blocky bracket to the bottom. I like making things look like they're factory, that people question whether did you do it or did the frame come like that when you bought it. I think that's always the goal, is the less people notice up front means you're doing your job right, as far as making things fit to the overall project. So I've got this thing clearanced enough that I can get it inside the frame where I want. Now I got to figure out how am I going to hold this thing in the frame and keep it level. I kind of figured out taking two of my rulers and making a surface to kind of pinch this within, and then spacing those rulers out until that bracket was level. Once I knew that that bracket was level and in place, I could move on to cutting out the center of this. The oil cap, or the fill cap, is actually dead in the center. So even though I think running this whole big plate of steel would look absolutely fucking ugly, I still wanted to do these kind of small ear mounts. They just look so much better. The less mounting you see, the better a bike looks. Is just let the cool parts shine. The work you do to make them sit on the bike, you're better off letting that take a back seat. So you can see I actually tack it to that longer flat plate to kind of hold everything in place. That way I can knock it around and make sure it's level. Then I cut it away. And now we're just going to hammer tune this thing so that it's actually level, measuring off the bottom of the frame to see what degrees. And then once I'm happy with it, send some fat welds in there. And then I'm just going to bend those ears down to follow the frame. So basically we have two parts that are perfectly level, and then the ends of those oil tank mounts are going to sit against the frame. And so yeah, got that thing in there, sitting level to the bottom of the frame. Again, this thing looks like an absolute fucking tractor right now, and I remember absolutely hating how this was going, but you got to commit. And yeah, even with the tins just kind of set on there, this thing is just looking pretty weird at this point. Biggest reason is you're also looking at the bike with it up at eye level. Real important, look at your shit on the ground. If you're ever questioning it, it's probably going to look a lot better. So moving on to the top engine mount, had this idea that I wanted to use this ring rolled stock that I made up and make my own bungs that were going to be the same diameter as the button head bolt heads. So everything was just like this really clean, on theme. The tank and the fender have all this arced pinstriping, like you saw before. So I'm really trying to follow the theme of the paint job on this bike. More so than if you were starting this bike from scratch. You can kind of go whichever direction you want. The theme of this bike is obviously set in stone with the paint job. So that's kind of where I'm having to step up to. Trying to find center and where to put these bungs. The way I did this was so much more of a challenge of trying to figure out where is center between the frame. As you saw, I put this big piece of plate stock up there to center my bung, and then it was just cutting all these arcs and fish mouthing the stock to fit to the bungs, and then just tacking everything in place. I didn't finish anything in like with the welder at this point because I wanted to kind of leave some flexibility in case when I started doing the fender and kind of carrying this theme into the back that I wouldn't be stuck with what I did up front if shit hit the fan in the back, as far as like mechanics, serviceability, anything like that. If something had to radically change, this area and the fender was where I was doing most of the kind of custom work that would make or break the details